900 years of tradition, one folded letter, and a cardinal who thought he was untouchable. But the moment that stopped the whole Vatican was not the letter at all. It was a single word, spoken quietly, that no one in that room expected to hear. That is where this begins. The morning it happened, Rome was already hot by 8 o'clock, the kind of heat that presses down on the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square and makes even the pigeons move slower. Inside the Apostolic Palace, in a room with windows thrown open to catch whatever breeze might wander up from the Tiber, Pope Matthias sat alone at a desk that had belonged to 3 popes before him. On the desk was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, unsealed, and utterly without precedent. It named a cardinal, it named a decision, and it would, within a matter of days, force the whole of the Roman Curia to ask a question it had not asked in living memory. What happens when the man who is supposed to answer to no one on earth is the one doing the confronting? To understand why that folded letter mattered, it helps to understand the man who wrote it and the man it was written about. Matthias had not wanted to be pope. Almost no one who becomes pope wanted to be pope. Not really. Not the way a person wants a promotion or a prize. The honest ones will tell you it felt more like being handed something too heavy to carry, and then being told to carry it anyway. He had spent most of his life in dusty diocesan offices and small parishes, first in a fishing town, where the salt air rusted everything within a decade, and later in a mission territory, where he learned to say Mass in 3 languages and to bury the dead in all 3 as well. He was known, before the conclave that changed his life, for 2 things: an almost stubborn insistence on plain language, and a habit of remembering the names of people other men in his position forgot. The woman who cleaned the chancery office at night, the seminarian who had dropped out and never come back, the driver who had waited outside a cathedral for 4 hours in the rain. When the white smoke rose and his name was announced from the balcony, there were cardinals in that room who wept not from joy but from surprise, because the man they had elected was not the diplomat, not the theologian with the sharpest pen, not the favourite of any faction. He was, as one old cardinal put it afterward, the only man in this room nobody was afraid of, and the only man in this room everybody trusted. That trust would be tested sooner than anyone expected, and the man who tested it was Cardinal Alessandro Ferretti. Ferretti was, by any measure of worldly success, one of the most powerful men in the Church. He ran one of its largest financial offices, the one responsible for the pensions of tens of thousands of priests and religious sisters across 4 continents, the one that quietly kept hospitals open in places where governments had long since stopped trying. He had a reputation for competence bordering on brilliance, for closing deals that other men couldn't close, for making difficult numbers behave. He also had a reputation, whispered in hallways and never quite said aloud in meetings, for a certain flexibility with the truth when the truth was inconvenient. For years, that reputation had been treated the way difficult truths often are in large institutions: noted, filed away, never quite acted upon, because acting upon it would mean admitting how deep the problem went. It was a young auditor, barely 30 years old, who first found the discrepancy. Her name does not matter for this telling, but her courage does. She had been asked to reconcile a set of investment records tied to a fund meant to support retired missionaries, men and women who had spent 40 or 50 years in remote parishes, and were now in their 80s and 90s, dependent on a stipend that was supposed to be untouchable. What she found, buried in 3 years of transfers, routed through shell entities in 2 different countries, was that nearly $40 million meant for that fund had instead financed a series of speculative real estate ventures that had gone spectacularly wrong, and ventures that Cardinal Ferretti had personally approved without informing the Oversight Board, whose job it was to catch exactly this kind of decision. She brought her findings first to her direct supervisor, who told her, not unkindly, to let it go. She brought them next to a mid-level Vatican ombudsman, who read 3 pages and then closed the folder and told her the matter was delicate. Finally, with nothing left to lose but her job and perhaps more than her job, she wrote a letter, 11 pages, dense with numbers, with account routing information, with dates. And she delivered it by hand to the one office in the entire Vatican that she believed could not simply make it disappear. She delivered it to the Pope's private secretary. Pope Matthias read that letter twice before he said a word to anyone. Those who worked closest to him that week remember him as unusually quiet, taking his meals alone, walking the palace gardens later into the evening than was his habit. He was not a man given to anger, but those who knew him well could tell the difference between his ordinary silence and this new, heavier kind. On the 4th night, according to one aide who was present, he finally spoke. He said, $40 million. Do you know how many retired sisters that would have fed? Do you know how many of them are eating 1 meal a day right now because that money isn't where it should be? And then, more quietly, he knew, and he let them go hungry. What followed was not the kind of drama that makes headlines in the way people expect. No shouting, no dramatic press conference, no public excommunication read aloud from a balcony. The church, for all its ancient theatre, often moves through crises the way water moves through stone, slowly, quietly, and with an inevitability that only becomes obvious in hindsight. Matthias summoned Ferretti to a private audience, the kind that appears on no public schedule and is attended by no press. What was said in that room has never been fully confirmed, but 3 separate accounts, given anonymously to journalists in the weeks that followed, agree on the essential shape of it. Ferretti arrived, by every account, entirely unworried. He had survived 4 popes and a dozen investigations. He had built a career on being the man who solved problems, not the man problems happened to. He is said to have brought with him a folder of his own, projections, explanations, the kind of technical language that had worked for him 100 times before, with men less patient or less informed than the one now sitting across the desk from him. And for the first several minutes, by these accounts, that language seemed to be working again. Matthias listened. He asked no questions. He let Ferretti talk. And then, according to the aide who waited just outside the door, there was a long silence. When Matthias finally spoke, he did not raise his voice. He is reported to have set the 11-page letter on the desk between them, turned so that Ferretti could see it, and to have said only this: "I am not going to ask you to explain the numbers. I have read the numbers. I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. Where did you think the sisters were going to eat?" There was no answer to that question, not one that could survive being spoken aloud in that room, in front of that man, under that gaze. Ferretti, who had talked his way through boardrooms and banking commissions and Vatican tribunals for 30 years, said nothing at all. 3 days later, the announcement came, and it came in language so plain that it startled even seasoned Vatican correspondents used to reading between the lines of papal statements for hidden meaning. There was no hidden meaning here. Cardinal Alessandro Ferretti was removed, effective immediately, from every financial office he held. He was stripped of his role on the oversight board. He was ordered to submit to a full canonical process, with cooperation with civil financial authorities in the countries where the shell transfers had occurred, and in a step that no pope in nearly a century had taken against a cardinal of his rank. Matthias suspended him from exercising any public ministry at all. No masses, no audiences, no public appearances of any kind, pending the outcome of that process. The Vatican press corps, which had grown used to a certain caution from the Holy See on matters involving senior churchmen, did not know quite what to do with a sentence as direct as the one issued that day. The Holy Father has determined that trust, once broken at this scale and at this cost to the most vulnerable among us, cannot be restored by explanation. It can only be restored by accountability. Analysts spent days parsing what accountability would actually mean in practice. Canon law is a slow and careful instrument, not built for speed. But the symbolic weight of the moment was not lost on anyone. A pope who had been elected, in part, because he seemed too gentle for the brutal machinery of Vatican politics, had just done something that men considered far more ruthless than him had never quite managed to do. He had moved against one of the most powerful men in the institution, publicly, decisively, and without apparent hesitation. Predictably, reactions split along familiar lines. There were cardinals who privately worried the move was too fast, too public, that it would embarrass the church rather than heal it, that these matters were traditionally handled with more discretion for good reason. One senior churchman, speaking to a reporter on condition of anonymity, said, "The Holy Father has enormous respect in this building. But respect and fear are different things, and I am not sure he understands yet how much fear this decision has created among men who thought their positions made them safe." Others saw exactly the opposite, not recklessness, but overdue courage. A theologian who had spent decades writing about institutional accountability in the church put it this way in a widely shared essay. "For years, the pattern has been the same. Protect the institution, protect the powerful, quietly manage the damage. What happened this week broke that pattern in public, on purpose, and it did so by centering the people the institution is supposed to serve, not the man who failed them, but the sisters who nearly went without. And yet none of that, not the removal, not the suspension, not the swirl of commentary that followed for weeks, was the moment that actually stayed with the people who were in Rome that month. The moment that stayed with them happened almost by accident, nearly 6 weeks later, in a hallway that no camera was pointed at. It happened like this. As part of the canonical process now underway, Ferretti had been required to vacate his official residence within the Vatican walls and had been temporarily housed in a modest guest apartment, usually reserved for visiting clergy of no particular rank. A small, almost startling demotion in the physical geography of a place where status is written into square footage. He was, by every account from those who saw him in that period, a changed man, gaunt, quiet, stripped of the easy confidence that had defined him for 30 years. Old allies did not call, old friends found reasons to be elsewhere. In an institution built on relationships, he had become, almost overnight, a man that no one wanted to be seen standing next to. One evening, walking back from a private chapel where he had gone, alone and unannounced, to pray, something several witnesses noted he had rarely done in his years of power, Ferretti encountered Pope Matthias in a narrow corridor of the palace, the kind of hallway where two men cannot easily avoid each other even if one of them very much wants to. There was no security detail nearby, no aide taking notes, no press. Just two old men in a quiet hallway at the end of a very long day. By the account later given by the single Swiss guard posted at the corridor's end, an account he did not intend to make public and only confirmed reluctantly, years later, when a historian tracking the incident finally tracked him down. Ferretti stopped and for the first time since the whole affair began did not try to explain himself. He simply said, "I don't know how to ask you for anything. I don't think I deserve to ask you for anything." And Matthias, who had every institutional and personal reason to walk past him, did not walk past him. He stopped. He is reported to have said only one word first, and it was not a word anyone expected from a pope who had just spent 6 weeks dismantling this man's career with what looked, from the outside, like total resolve. The word was, "sit." There was a small stone bench built into an alcove along that corridor, the kind meant for weary pilgrims rather than cardinals or popes, and the two men sat on it together, the most powerful man in the church and the most disgraced one, saying very little for what the guard estimated was nearly 20 minutes. What was actually said between them has never been fully reported, and perhaps never will be, because neither man has chosen to share it, and both, by every indication, seem to want it kept that way. But the guard did report one more detail, the detail that later found its way, carefully, respectfully, into a handful of retrospective pieces about the whole affair. As the two men eventually rose to leave, Matthias placed a hand briefly on Ferretti's shoulder and said, "The church you failed is not finished asking things of you. But it is not finished loving you either. Those are not the same sentence, and I need you to understand that they are not the same sentence." It is worth pausing on why that detail, more than any headline about suspensions or oversight boards, is the one people who followed this story kept returning to. The decision to remove Ferretti from power was, in the end, a decision anyone with sufficient information and sufficient courage might eventually have made. It was the application of a rule to a man who had broken it, however rare it was to see that rule applied at such a height. But the hallway was something else. It was not governance. It was not policy. It was a man who had every right to feel nothing but anger toward another man, choosing instead to sit beside him on a cold stone bench and remind him, in the middle of his worst humiliation, that accountability and abandonment are not the same thing, that a person can be required to answer fully for what he has done and still not be discarded as a human being. The canonical process against Ferretti continued for the better part of a year after that hallway encounter, moving with the careful, unhurried pace such processes are built to move at. The restitution efforts, complicated and imperfect as they always are when money has passed through as many hands as it had, slowly began returning what could be returned to the fund meant for those retired missionaries. Not all of it, not quickly, but visibly, publicly, in a way that made clear the institution intended to see it through, rather than let it quietly fade from memory, the way so many such stories had faded before. Ferretti himself was never restored to financial authority. He spent the remainder of his active ministry, once it was eventually and narrowly permitted to resume in a far smaller capacity, working directly with the retired religious whose fund he had endangered, an assignment that some read as a kind of quiet penance, and that he himself, in the only public statement he ever gave about the whole affair, described simply as the only work I have left that I actually deserve to do. As for Matthias, he never spoke publicly again about the specifics of what happened in that hallway, and when asked directly years later, by a journalist who had somehow learned of the encounter, whether it was difficult to show mercy to a man he had just spent weeks holding accountable, he gave an answer that has since been quoted more often than almost anything else from his pontificate. He said, "People think accountability and mercy pull against each other, that you have to choose which one you believe in. I don't think that's true. I think the whole difficulty of this life, and maybe the whole point of it, is learning to hold both of them in your two hands at the same time, and to never let go of either one." It was a small sentence said quietly, in an interview that ran only a few paragraphs in a religious affairs section most people never read. But it travelled anyway, the way a certain kind of true thing always seems to travel, further and faster than anyone expects, until people who had never followed a single detail of the Ferretti affair found themselves repeating it in entirely unrelated conversations about their own families, their own failures, their own hallways they had once stood in, with someone they had every reason to walk past and somehow, instead, chose to sit down beside. That, in the end, is the story people remember when they remember Pope Matthias and the cardinal he confronted. Not the letter, not the suspension, not even the $40 million or the sisters who nearly went hungry, though all of that mattered and all of that was real. What they remember is a stone bench in a quiet hallway, and a man with every right to walk away choosing instead to say a single word, sit, and in that single word somehow saying everything the whole affair had actually been about all along. But there is more to this story than the hallway, more than the letter, more than the bench. To understand it fully, it helps to go back further, to a version of Alessandro Ferretti that almost no one in Rome remembered by the time the scandal broke, and to a version of the young auditor whose courage started the whole chain of events, and to the 89-year-old missionary sister whose name, more than any other, would come to define what the affair was really about. Ferretti had not always been the man in the tailored cassock, the man with the private car and the reputation for making difficult numbers behave. 40 years earlier, he had been a parish priest in a coastal town not unlike the one where Matthias himself had started. A young man with calloused hands, from helping fishermen mend nets between confessions, known then not for financial brilliance but for an almost reckless generosity. He had once sold his own late mother's ring to pay for a parishioner's surgery, a story that had circulated quietly among the older priests of his diocese for years afterward. It was precisely that reputation for selflessness that had first drawn the attention of his bishop, who recommended him for further studies in administration, believing a man that generous with his own resources could be trusted with everyone else's. It is one of the quieter tragedies of the story that the very qualities that first elevated Ferretti, his competence, his confidence, his gift for making institutions run smoothly, were the same qualities that, decades later and worn down by ambition and the slow accumulation of small compromises, curdled into the very failure that destroyed him. No one becomes the man in that hallway overnight. It takes years and 100 small permissions granted to oneself, each one easier than the last. The young auditor, for her part, paid a price for her courage that the official record of the affair does not fully capture. In the months after she delivered her letter, she found herself quietly frozen out of further assignments, her emails to senior staff going unanswered for days, her name mysteriously absent from meetings she should have been included in. It would have been easy, and understandable, for her to conclude that speaking the truth had cost her everything and gained her nothing. She has said, in the one interview she ever gave about the experience, that there was a period of nearly 2 months where she genuinely believed her career inside the Vatican's financial offices was over, and that she had ruined it for nothing. What she did not know during those 2 months was that her letter was sitting on the desk of a man who read it twice before saying a word to anyone, and who was, in his own quiet way, building toward the moment that would eventually vindicate every sleepless night she had spent, wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake. When the announcement finally came, and her name, at her own request, was kept entirely out of it, she has said she felt something closer to relief than triumph. The particular relief of a person who did the right thing, not knowing whether it would matter, and then watched it matter after all. And then there was Sister Agnesa. She was 89 years old at the time of the scandal, though she would have told you, with the particular dry humour common to women who have spent 7 decades in religious life, that she felt closer to 109 most mornings. She had entered her order at 19, had spent 41 of her 68 years in vows serving in a single mission hospital in a region so remote that mail sometimes took 6 weeks to arrive, and had returned to a small retirement convent only when her eyesight had finally failed enough that she could no longer safely assist in surgery. She was, by the time the fund was compromised, entirely dependent on the modest stipend it provided, a stipend that, in the months before the scandal broke, had already begun arriving late and reduced, though no one had explained to her or to the sisters who lived alongside her exactly why. She had, without knowing the cause, begun quietly skipping her evening meal twice a week to make her small savings stretch further, a fact that only came to light because a younger sister in her community happened to mention it, almost in passing, to a visiting priest, who happened to mention it to someone else, who eventually made sure it reached the desk of the Pope's private secretary in the same week as the auditor's letter. It is worth being precise about what those 2 documents, arriving in the same week, actually meant, because it is easy, in the retelling, to make Matthias's response sound like simple outrage at a spreadsheet. It was not that, It was the collision of an abstraction. $40 million, shell entities, a name on an oversight board, with a specific, unbearable fact. A woman who had spent her entire adult life pulling other people back from the edge of death was quietly going hungry twice a week because a man who wanted for nothing had decided her money could be put to more interesting use. Those who were in the room when Matthias was told about Sister Agnes's meals say it was that detail, more than any of the financial documentation, that changed the tenor of everything that followed. Numbers can be argued with. A missed meal cannot. When the story eventually broke publicly, not through any Vatican announcement, but through a persistent journalist who had spent months quietly verifying the auditor's original findings, it was Sister Agnes's name, deliberately included this time, with her own blessing, that turned what might have remained a dry institutional scandal into something the wider world actually stopped to read. She gave one brief statement to the reporter who found her, delivered with the same dry humour she had carried through 7 decades of religious life. "I did not become a nun to be famous, and I certainly did not expect to become famous over missed dinners. But if my missed dinners are what it took for someone to finally look closely at where our money was going, then I suppose I am glad my stomach made more noise than my letters did." That line, more than any statement issued by the Vatican press office, was reprinted in newspapers on 4 continents within a week. In the months after the scandal became public, something unexpected happened, something that none of the official planning around the crisis had anticipated. Donations to the Retired Missionaries Fund, the very fund Ferretti had endangered, began arriving from ordinary parishioners around the world, many of them explicitly citing Sister Agnes's statement as the reason. A parish in a fishing town, not unlike the one where both Matthias and, decades earlier, Ferretti himself had begun their priesthoods, raised more money for the fund in a single collection than it had raised for any cause in a decade. A group of retired nurses in a country thousands of miles from Rome organised what they called Agnes's Table, a modest annual fundraising dinner whose proceeds went directly to ensuring that no retired religious sister anywhere in their diocese would ever again quietly skip a meal to make ends meet. Sister Agnes herself, when told of this, is reported to have laughed and said she hoped whoever was running the dinner at least made sure the food was good, since she had gone without enough of it herself to have opinions on the matter. It would be tidy, and perhaps satisfying, to end the story there, scandal exposed, wrongdoer held accountable, victims made whole, ordinary generosity rising to fill the gap that institutional failure had left behind. But the real ending, the one that those closest to the whole affair still talk about, when they talk about it at all, returns to that hallway, and to a detail that has never been widely reported until now. Roughly a year after the encounter on the stone bench, once Ferretti had begun the smaller, quieter work, he had been permitted to resume among the very retired religious. His failure had endangered, he asked through an intermediary, whether he might be allowed to meet Sister Agnes directly. It was not an easy request to grant. There were those in the Vatican who felt it was inappropriate, even cruel to her, to place the man responsible for her hunger in the same room as the woman who had gone without meals because of him. Matthias, when consulted, did not make the decision himself. He asked that the choice be given entirely to Sister Agnesa, with no pressure in either direction, and that whatever she decided would be respected completely. She said yes. The meeting, when it finally happened, was brief. No more than 20 minutes, held in the small common room of her retirement convent, with a single sister present as witness at Agnes's own request, so that someone besides God knows exactly what was said, in case either of us tries to improve the story later. According to that witness, Ferretti began by trying once more to explain himself, the old instinct still not entirely broken, even after a year of quiet penance. Sister Agnesa, by the witness's account, let him get perhaps 2 sentences into it, before she held up one thin, spotted hand and stopped him. "I did not agree to see you so you could explain yourself to me a second time," she is reported to have said. "I have read the explanations. I would like, instead, for you to tell me something true about yourself that has nothing to do with any of this." There was a long silence, the witness recalled. Longer even than the silence in the hallway with Matthias a year earlier. And then Ferretti, for the first time in the entire affair, according to everyone who had watched it unfold, began to speak not as a man defending himself, but simply as a man. About the coastal town where he had grown up. About a mother whose ring he had once sold without regret to pay for someone else's surgery. About the boy he had been before he became the man everyone in Rome had learned to fear and then to pity. Sister Agnes listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she is said to have nodded once, slowly, and said only, "There he is, I wondered if he was still in there somewhere." Then she asked him, in the same breath and the same dry tone, whether he had eaten lunch, And when he admitted he had not, she instructed the witnessing sister to bring him a plate from the kitchen. Because whatever else is true, no one leaves this room hungry. That, at least, is one thing I intend to make sure of for the rest of my life. He ate the meal she gave him in near silence, in the small common room of a convent he had once, without ever meeting her, nearly starved her out of. Neither of them, by every account, ever spoke publicly about what passed between them that afternoon beyond the barest outline, and neither has ever asked the other for anything since. But those who know both of them say that Ferretti has never again, in all the years since, skipped an opportunity to personally check on the well-being of the religious sisters he now serves, down to the smallest detail of whether their meals have arrived on time, and that Sister Agnesa, whenever his name comes up, still refers to him not as the cardinal who failed her, but simply and without explanation, as the boy from the coastal town. Perhaps that is the truest ending this story has to offer. Not the letter that began it, not the suspension that punished it, not even the hallway where a pope chose mercy alongside accountability. The truest ending is a plate of food, offered without conditions, by the very woman who had least reason in the world to offer it. Proof, if proof was ever needed, that the deepest kind of justice in this life rarely arrives as punishment alone, and that it is very often, in the end, delivered quietly, at a small table, by the person everyone assumed had been left with nothing left to give. This has been a work of fiction, inspired by themes of accountability and mercy within institutional life, and does not depict any real pope, cardinal, or Vatican event. If this kind of story moved you, subscribe for more reflections like it, and leave a comment about the moment that stayed with you most.